Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is great to have you with us again.
Yeah, fantastic to be digging into another topic.
We absolutely love getting these source materials from you, the listeners, and just unpacking them. And hey, if you enjoy what we do here, please take a moment to like, share, and comment.
It honestly makes a huge difference. Helps us keep the lights on and, keep making these deep dives.
It really does. So today, we're looking at a real titan of aviation, the Tupolev Tu-160. NATO calls it the Blackjack.
But the Russians, they often call it the White Swan. Much more poetic, I think.
It is, isn't it? And this whole dive, it's built from that stack of sources you sent in. We've got excerpts from that Midland Red Star PDF.
Right, the one on Scribd. It's really detailed.
Articles from the national interests, some Reddit threads, which are always interesting, and the usual Wikipedia entries to fill in gaps.
Good mix.
So, the mission, like always. Let's sift through this pile together, pull out the important bits. Why was this thing built? What were some of the wild design ideas?
What went wrong when it first entered service? Because things always go wrong.
Oh, yeah. And sort of, where does it fit in now? Let's get into it.
Okay, so origins. It really starts with a need, right? The Soviet Union, they needed a new heavy hitter, a strategic bomber.
Not just a bomber, but one with, like, way more capability, bigger payload, better performance.
Exactly, a significant step up. And that kicked off a real battle between the design bureaus, the OKBs.
The big names, Myasishchev, Sukhoi.
Yep. Myasishchev had their M18 and M20 concepts. Sukhoi came in with the T-4MS.
And the interesting thing from the sources is that Myasishchev's M18, even though Tupolev got the final contract, well, the M18's basic layout looks a lot like the Tu-160.
It does. You can see the lineage there, the basic shape, the wing placement. It clearly influenced the final design.
But man, some of the ideas they played with before getting there were out there.
Definitely. Look at the Sukhoi T-4MS mock-ups. Some show this landing gear with these enormous, 12-wheel bogies, just massive.
Uncomical looking.
And the Myasishchev M20. That went through tons of versions. We saw canard designs, so tail-first layouts.
Right, and blended wing body attempts.
Yeah, trying to smooth everything out. Even some really strange landing gear, like a bicycle setup with little outrigger wheels.
Like on some older bombers.
Yeah.
But on this scale.
Exactly. And the engine placements were all over the place, too. One M20 idea had all 4 engines crammed into one big pod under the fuselage.
With a split intake, right?
Yeah, bifurcated. Or another stacked them vertically, 2 by 2, a bit like the old British Lightning fighter.
Wow. So they were really exploring the design space, drooping noses, S-shaped inlets, boundary layer control, all sorts of advanced stuff early on.
They're pushing hard to meet some really tough requirements.
Speaking of requirements, what exactly did the government order the GOR demand? It wasn't just build a new bomber, was it?
No, it was very specific. The sources say a mandatory 1.8 times increase in warload compared to previous bombers.
That's huge.
It is. Plus, it needed serious electronic countermeasures, ECM, for actually penetrating enemy airspace, not just launching missiles from afar.
And the thrust-to-weight ratio. That was a big one, too.
Yeah, 1.5 to 1.7 times better. A massive jump.
And why such a high thrust-to-weight? The sources link that to needing to operate from rough, unpaved airstrips, right? Class 1 strips.
Exactly. Imagine this monster needing short field, rough field capability. It's kind of mind-boggling.
But there was a downside to demanding all that speed and power.
Oh, yeah. Myasishchev's initial studies showed it pretty clearly. Pushing for that kind of performance, especially the high speed, it hammers the range.
How much?
Their calculations suggested a drop of maybe 28 to 30% in calculated range compared to a slower, more optimized design.
Wow, that's a significant strategic trade-off. You can't go as far.
It really highlights that classic design tension, speed, payload, range. You can't max out everything. Something's got to give.
So hitting these targets must have taken a colossal R&D effort.
Absolutely massive. The sources talk about 1,200 hours of just computer analysis comparing different layouts.
And the wind tunnels.
Tons of wind tunnel work at TSCGI, the big Aero Research Institute. Something like 14 different models tested, covering weights from 150 all the way up to 300 tons, just constantly optimizing.
Okay, so let's talk about the winning design, the Tupolev Tu-160. What made it stand out? Obviously the wings.
The variable sweep wings, yeah, they're the defining feature visually.
3 main settings, right?
Yep. Fully forward at 20 degrees for takeoff, landing, slow flight, then 35 degrees for cruising efficiently subsonically, and swept way back to 65 degrees for the high-speed dash.
And holding those massive wings together is a huge piece of metal.
Oh, yeah. That wing pivot box, the carry-through structure, and the fuselage, it's enormous. The sources say 12.4 meters long, over 2 meters wide, mostly titanium.
Just incredible engineering. And powering it all, 4 big engines.
The Samara NK-32s, turbofans, huge power. Over 55,000 pounds of thrust each in afterburner, according to the specs listed. They definitely delivered on that high thrust requirement.
And their placement is pretty distinctive, paired up under the outer wings.
Right. Which, as the sources explain, wasn't the only idea considered. They looked at clustering them, maybe like the early Tu-144 supersonic transport.
But that caused problems on the Tu-144. Drag, pressure loss,
Yeah.
if one failed.
Exactly. Cascade failures were a risk, so they went back towards that Mach M18 concept, separating them into pairs under the wings.
And the big advantage of doing that?
It cleared out the whole center line of the aircraft fuselage. Prime real estate right near the center of gravity.
For weapons?
For 2 massive internal weapons bays, crucial for carrying big missiles inside, which helps with, reducing the radar signature.
Makes sense. What about the intakes feeding those engines? Variable geometry.
Yes, variable supersonic intakes. They used vertical ramps to control the airflow. Apparently this was tested on the Tu-144 too, though that plane used horizontal ramps.
Allows the engines to breathe properly across that whole speed range, from subsonic to Mach 2+.
Right. They looked at other setups, those vertical pairs again, or even 3 engines, but dropped them. Tech problems or worries about, survivability for the stacked engine idea?
The materials were pretty advanced for the Soviets at the time, too.
Very much so. Lots of titanium, about 38% according to one source. A good chunk of aluminum alloys, 58%.
Yeah.
Some high-strength steel, 15%. And a bit of composites, 3%.
And they were making really large parts.
Yeah, things like 20-meter-long skin panels with the stiffeners built right in. Fewer joints means less weight, more strength. Pretty advanced manufacturing.
And a huge lead for a Soviet heavy was the flight control system.
The fly-by-wire, FDW. That was a first for a Soviet aircraft this size.
And crucially, no mechanical backup. Purely electronic signals.
That's what the sources say. A big vote of confidence in the tech. It allowed things like active stability control, even letting it fly with a less stable center of gravity for better performance.
And a fighter-style joystick instead of a big yoke.
Yep.
More responsive feel, maybe. But the real benefits were performance. The FBW could keep the plane trimmed perfectly for optimal range.
Squeezing out every mile.
Exactly. And better handling across the board. Plus, less wrestling with the controls meant less pilot fatigue on those really long missions.
Okay, let's talk landing gear. It looks incredibly tough, gives it that sort of stocky appearance on the ground.
It absolutely does. Built like a tank,
Phew.
tricycle gear, the nose gear is steerable, twin wheels, retracts backwards. And it has that prominent mud guard.
Reflecting that rough field requirement again.
Definitely. But the main gear units, they're the really wild part.
Based on the Tu-154 airliner, right, but scaled up.
Yeah, fundamentally. 6-wheel bogies arranged as 3 pairs, one behind the other. When they retract, they swing backwards into the fuselage.
They also rotate.
Right, 180 degrees. And there's this complex double hinge system that lets them tilt inwards as they retract.
Why tilt inwards? To narrow the track, basically make the whole assembly thinner so it fits neatly into the gear bay in the fuselage. It's complex, but clearly designed for heavy loads and maybe uneven surfaces.
They even put little lights on the struts.
Yeah, pilot lights. Just small lights so the ground crew could easily see if the gear was down and locked at night or in bad weather. Simple, but practical. Okay, moving on from the structure. Stealth. Was it a stealth bomber?
Well, not in the way we think of the B-2, all flying wing and exotic coatings.
Oh.
But the sources make it clear there was a conscious effort to reduce its radar signature.
What kind of measures?
Things like radar-absorbent material, RAM, used on the engine intake ducts. They're described as having this black graphite-based coating,
Okay.
special paint on the forward fuselage, screens placed over certain engine components to reduce reflections, and even a fine wire mesh integrated into the cockpit windows.
And that mesh did double duty.
Yeah, reduced electromagnetic emissions coming out, but also offer the crew some protection against the blinding flash from nuclear detonation, a grim reminder of its mission.
Speaking of defense, they initially planned for a tailgun, didn't they? Classic Soviet bomber feature.
Yes, a multi-barrel cannon, the GSF-630. But Tupolev argued against it.
Why?
They convinced the authorities that a more capable, modern electronic countermeasure suite would be more effective for survival. Plus, dropping the guns saved weight and freed up space.
Makes sense. Did they ever build that dedicated ECM version, the Tu-160
No, that variant was proposed but never actually built.
PP?
They did add some things later, like rear-view periscopes for the Navigator WSO, and you can see the ESM antennas on the trailing edge of the tail fin.
Okay, let's get to the pointy end. The weapons, carried in those two big internal bays.
And the size of those bays was apparently dictated by the need to carry the original monster missile, the KH-45.
Which was enormous, right?
Yeah, the specs were wild. Over 10 meters long, 4.5 tons, designed for insane speeds like Mach 7 or 8. Carrying that internally was key for stealth.
Did they plan for other weapons, too?
Oh, yeah. The KH-15, a smaller short-range missile. Plans were to carry up to 24 of those on rotary launchers inside the bays, plus conventional bombs and, of course, long-range cruise missiles.
But there was a bit of a gap initially.
Well, the sources mentioned that the specific low-level subsonic cruise missiles they really wanted weren't quite ready when the Blackjack first came into service, and that KH-15S anti-ship version never actually integrated.
So what became the main weapon?
The KH-55SM cruise missile, that became its bread and butter. Stated range of around 3,000 kilometers.
And how does that launch?
It's pretty involved. The missile gets pushed downwards out of the bay on its rotary launcher. Then its wings and tail pop out, the little turbofan engine starts up, and it flies off, following a pre-programmed route using digital terrain maps.
So the WSO, the Weapons Systems Officer, is pretty busy.
Absolutely.
Guiding the bomber to the precise launch point, managing the systems, monitoring the missile release, a critical role.
And inside the cockpit, who else is there?
4 crew members total. Pilot and co-pilot up front. Then behind them, the Bombardier WSO and a Defensive Systems Officer, the DSO.
All on ejection seats.
Yes, K-36DL seats. Good seats, rated for 0-0 ejection, 0 speed, 0 altitude. And there's a system to sequence the ejections if the whole crew needs to bail out.
And the instrument panel. A mix of old and new.
Yeah, a combination. Still had plenty of traditional analog dials and gauges, but also incorporated some of the newer multifunction displays, MFDs.
And we have to mention the famous Carlucci panel.
Ah, yes. The story goes, U.S. Defense Secretary Frank Carlucci visited in '88, toured the cockpit, and apparently banged his head on a particular overhead circuit breaker panel.
Because the cockpit's pretty tight.
Very confined, apparently. And because it happened to visitors so often, the Soviet crews supposedly nicknamed that panel the Carlucci panel. A funny little human detail.
What are the navigation systems, besides the cruise missile guidance?
The mission avionics included things like Loran receivers for long-range navigation, a celestial corrector, basically an automated star tracker.
Still useful over vast oceans or the Arctic before GPS was common.
Exactly. And a PA-3 moving map display. A proper satellite navigation system was planned for later upgrades. But getting all that targeting and nav software debugged and working reliably, that was apparently a bit of an ongoing process.
Yeah, complex systems always have bugs, so getting this beast from the drawing board to the flight line, not smooth sailing.
Far from it. Even the very first flight had a bit of drama around the date.
Right, December 18th, 1981. Boris Varemi flew it for about 27 minutes. But the sources say he was supposed to fly the next day.
Yeah, the 19th was Leonid Brezhnev's birthday. The flight was maybe intended as a sort of present for the leader, but they went a day early.
How did that first flight go?
Apparently very well.
Yeah.
Matched the ground simulation data closely, and because it was fly-by-wire, they could take pilot feedback immediately and tweak the control system software right away.
Testing must have been intense after that.
Oh, yes. They used complex ground test rigs, Iron Birds, to ring out the systems. And Varemi, the chief test pilot, flew the wings off it. Logged over 600 flights, more than 2,000 hours in the prototype and early models. Now, how did the West find out about it? This was still the Cold War, pretty secret stuff.
Yeah.
Classic spy story, almost. November 81. An Aeroflot passenger flying near the Zhukovsky Test Center just happened to look down and see this huge, unfamiliar white bomber parked next to some Tu-144 supersonic transports.
And snapped a photo.
Managed to get a covert picture. Blurry, unofficial. But because the Tu-144's dimensions were known...
Analysts could compare.
Exactly. U.S. Intel used the Tu-144s in the photo as a reference scale and got a surprisingly good estimate of the new bomber's size, which was big.
Right.
Really big.
So the cat was out of the bag. NATO gave it the temporary name Ram-P, thinking it was based at Ramenskoye.
Right. Then later updated it to Blackjack. That name stuck, even though the Russians preferred White Swan.
Was the exposure deliberate? Propaganda, maybe?
Some people speculated that, but the sources mostly argue against it. This was before Glasnost, and the photos seemed genuinely accidental. Probably just bad luck for Soviet security.
Production then started up at Kazan plant.
Yep. The first Kazan-built production aircraft flew in October 1984. These incorporated changes from testing, like a slightly reshaped nose, and they wore that iconic white anti-flash paint scheme.
Unlike the camouflage B-1.
Right, and they were built in small batches, usually like 5 aircraft at a time.
But getting them into actual service with the Air Force units, that's where the real headaches began.
Oh, yeah. The sources describe major teething troubles when the 184th Regiment at Purluki got their first Tu-160s.
Especially for the ground crews.
It sounds like hell, frankly. Preparing one for a mission could take like 36 hours initially. Engine startup was deafening 130 decibels and vibrated the whole airframe violently.
And they didn't even have proper ear protection at first.
Or good boots or belts to handle the heavy equipment. Plus, they had issues with corrosive hydraulic fluid leaking, and many components were apparently a nightmare at access and repair. The technicians got called black men because they were always covered in grime.
And the aircraft itself had issues. Mechanical stuff.
Definitely. The NK-32 engines had a really low initial time between overhaul, only 250 hours.
That's terrible.
It got much better later, up to 750 hours eventually. But initially, yeah, not great. They also had problems with engine compressor stalls.
Fixed by adding more blow-in doors to the intakes.
Right, and vibrations. The fairings around the tail fin and stabilizers shook so badly they were damaging the sensitive ESM gear inside. Had to reshape and shorten those fairings.
And then there's the story of Pavlov's calculated failure. Sounds ominous.
It was a specific incident during testing, a total electrical system failure. Traced back to a really obscure overload protection failure deep within an electronic component, something you couldn't really predict.
A cascade failure.
Exactly. It was analyzed intensely and became this internal shorthand, Pavlov's calculated failure, for that kind of complex, unforeseeable system breakdown. Led to design changes, obviously.
So how did they fix all these problems?
Massive industry support. The Ministry of Aircraft Production, MAP, actually sent huge teams, up to 300 engineers and technicians, directly to the airbase at Purluki.
Work on the planes right there.
Yeah, alongside the Air Force crews. Meant they could troubleshoot and implement fixes much faster. Those fixes then got rolled back into the production line in Kazan, too.
Despite all this, what did the crews think? The pilots, the maintainers.
There's a quote from a 1989 Red Star article. They said the plane won our hearts with its sheer capability. But they were also critical, felt Tupolev had too much of a monopoly, maybe got complacent. They kind of missed the competitive pressure from bureaus like Miyasishev that existed during the design competition phase.
Interesting perspective. So despite the teething troubles, how quickly did they get operational?
Surprisingly fast, actually. The 184th Regiment at Purluki reached operational readiness in just 8 months. They ramped up flying hours, started doing regular long-range missions, 6 to 12 hours typically.
And pilots liked flying it, compared to older types.
Generally, yes. Many transitioning from Tu-22M backfires or Tu-95 Bears reportedly saw it as a huge improvement, the best thing they'd flown. The automation helped too, especially for the WSO managing the complex weapons systems.
What kind of missions were they designed for?
2 main profiles: high-altitude supersonic penetration and also very low-level terrain following flight, hugging the ground to avoid radar. Though the sources suggest that low-level, high-speed terrain following was really demanding, and maybe not all crews fully mastered it. They often used support aircraft, like an airborne command post variant called Aircraft 976, during live missile launches.
And during the Cold War, they were actively patrolling.
Oh yes, frequent flights up towards the North Pole, towards Canada, often intercepted by NATO fighters. Norwegians, British Typhoons, or Tornadoes, the usual cat-and-mouse games.
Flying in pairs was common over water.
Yeah, partly for mutual support, psychological comfort, but mainly for search and rescue. If one went down over the Arctic Ocean, the other was right there.
Although, interestingly, the Blackjack crews didn't initially have the best immersion suits.
Right. The sources mentioned that naval aviation crews had better gear for ditching in cold water, maybe an oversight initially.
Fast forward a bit. The Tu-160 has made some high-profile trips recently.
Yeah, deployments to Venezuela in 2008 and 2018 always generated headlines, usually shadowed by NATO fighters across the Atlantic.
And its first trip to Africa.
Landed in South Africa in 2019, another demonstration of long-range capability.
It set some records, too, endurance flights.
Yep, a 23-hour nonstop flight back in 2010. It's taken part in big exercises, reportedly fired a full load of cruise missiles in one go in 2008. There were claims in 2006 of Arctic flights that supposedly evaded U.S. radar sectors.
and the father of all bombs connection.
Mentioned in the sources, yeah, Russia deploying this massive thermobaric bomb in 2007, though there seems to be some question about whether a Tu-160 actually delivered it.
And it has seen actual combat.
It has. Its combat debut was reported in November 2015, launching Kh-101 cruise missiles against targets in Syria.
And more recently.
Sources indicate its use in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, firing Kh-101s again in March and June of 2022. We're just relaying what the provided sources state here, of course.
Looking ahead, there's a big modernization effort, the Tu-160M.
Yes, focused heavily on new electronics, new avionics, updated cockpit displays. They're upgrading existing airframes.
Oh, and building brand new ones, too.
That's the plan. The first flight of a newly built Tu-160M happened in January 2022. Recent reports talk about the pace of modernization and integrating more modern weapons.
But sources also mentioned recent reports of attacks, drone attacks.
Yeah, there was a report cited from January 2025 about a drone hitting the Kazan factory where they're built, and another claim from June 2025 about drones hitting Part Tu-160s at an airbase. Again, just reporting what's in the material provided.
Okay, a really crucial and messy part of the Tu-160 story is what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Absolutely, because when the USSR broke apart, Ukraine suddenly found itself owning 19 Tu-160s that were based at Pryluki Air Base on its territory.
But Ukraine declared itself non-nuclear and didn't really have a mission or the money for these strategic bombers.
Right. They couldn't support them, no spare parts, no maintenance infrastructure, really. They quickly became grounded, unflyable by the mid-90s.
Ukraine tried to use them as a bargaining chip, didn't they, with Russia?
Yeah, especially regarding massive debts Ukraine owed Russia for natural gas. They apparently asked for something like $3 billion for the bombers, which Russia balked at.
So what happened?
Talks stalled. Ukraine, partly under the U.S. Nunn-Lugar program aimed at securing Soviet WMDs, actually started scrapping some of the Blackjacks, cutting them up.
But eventually a deal was made.
Yes, in 1999, Russia agreed to take 8 of the remaining Tu-160s plus 3 Tu-95MS Bear bombers and a package of cruise missiles, basically in exchange for forgiving $285 million of Ukraine's gas debt.
And the crews. What happened to the Ukrainian personnel who flew and maintained them?
This is interesting. A significant number of them, pilots and ground crew, actually chose to relocate to Russia and transfer to the Russian Air Force so they could keep working with the Tu-160s at their new base, Engels 2.
So Russia had to basically reconstitute its Blackjack force at Engels.
Pretty much. Combining these transferred Ukrainian aircraft with the few they already had or were building, the first Russian Blackjack flight and missile launch actually happened back in '92.
But keeping them combat ready was a struggle for Russia, too. Funding issues.
Definitely. The sources mentioned challenges in maintaining proficiency, especially compared to U.S. bomber crews. Things like getting enough flight hours, enough aerial refueling practice. They even used older Tu-134 jetliners converted as trainers, the Tu-134 UBL, just to save flight hours on the actual bombers.
You can't talk Tu-160 without comparing it to the B-1B Lancer.
Inevitable comparison. They look superficially similar big swing-wing bombers from the same era, but the details are different.
How so?
The nose shape, the spine along the top of the fuselage, the wing gloves, the tail fin leading edge, and definitely that landing gear. The Tu-160's gear is way more complex looking.
Performance-wise.
The main difference highlighted is speed. The Tu-160, with those powerful engines and variable intakes, can achieve higher top speeds, reportedly well over Mach 2. The B-1B's intakes are simpler, fixed, optimized more for reducing radar cross-section than for pure speed.
What do Russian experts say? The sources quote some generals.
Yeah, figures like LT General Operin, General Deinekin, they obviously rate the Tu-160 very highly, calling it an aircraft of the 21st century, a worthy rival. They believe its overall design and performance give it an edge.
There was that one time they were parked side by side.
Right, at Poltava Air Base in Ukraine in 1994. A unique chance for U.S. and Russian crews to see each other's aircraft up close. Probably a lot of professional curiosity there.
But despite the praise, Russia still struggled to keep the fleet fully operational.
The sources consistently point to funding and readiness challenges compared to the U.S. B-1 fleet, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. Maintaining proficiency requires constant flying and training.
Even back during that Carlucci visit in '88, there was that anecdote about engine start problems.
Yeah, apparently some of the Tu-160s had trouble starting an engine for a demonstration flight and ended up taking off on 3 engines. Showed pilot skill, maybe, but also highlighted that the systems weren't perfectly reliable yet.
And finally, the Tu-160 holds some world records.
Tupolev claimed several FAI records for it, yeah. Things like payload to altitude records, speed over closed courses, carrying different weights, showcasing the raw performance potential.
It definitely had potential.
No doubt.
So that wraps up our deep dive on the Tupolev Tu-160, from its ambitious birth in that Soviet design competition,
Driven by those really demanding requirements.
through a pretty rough development and entry into service full of those technical quirks and challenges,
That needed a huge effort from engineers on the ground to fix.
to its operational history, the Cold War patrols, the high-profile flights, the combat missions.
And that whole complicated post-Soviet story with Ukraine and the transfer back to Russia.
It's undeniably a powerful, very distinctive aircraft, the White Swan versus the Blackjack. And there's still that debate about how it really compares to rivals like the B-1.
It's a machine that really embodies the peak of Soviet aerospace ambition, but also the practical difficulties and the geopolitical roller coaster of the last few decades.
Its whole story is just this blend of cutting-edge tech, operational struggles, political twists.
It really makes you ponder, doesn't it? What does the saga of an aircraft like the Tu-160 tell us about strategic power itself? About the immense cost and complexity of projecting force on that scale?
Yeah, and what makes a military aircraft truly great or well-regarded in the long run? Is it just the specs on paper? Is it how ready it is day to day, its actual impact on history? Or is it something else?
A good question to leave folks with.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Tu-160 Blackjack White Swan. Hope you found it interesting. And please, if you did, hit that like button. Share it with someone who might enjoy it. Leave a comment. It really does help us out.
It does indeed. Thanks, everyone.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.